June 4, 1942 arrived with deceptive calm across the central Pacific, though the waters near Midway Atoll churned with tensions that would reshape naval warfare forever. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the super battleship Yamato, his eyes fixed on the horizon where American forces lay hidden, unaware that his carefully orchestrated trap was about to spring shut on his own fleet. The architect of Pearl Harbor carried the weight of Japan's destiny on his shoulders, yet something gnawed at his instincts, a whisper of doubt that refused to fade despite the overwhelming confidence surrounding him. 6 months had passed since Japanese forces had delivered their devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Empire's naval superiority seemed unquestionable. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the 1st Air Fleet, the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled, consisting of 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These floating fortresses had terrorized Allied positions from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean, leaving destruction in their wake. The plan for Midway appeared flawless: draw out the remaining American carriers, destroy them in a decisive engagement, and force the United States to negotiate peace on Japanese terms. According to historical documentation preserved in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive work, History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, Japanese naval officers believed American morale had been shattered beyond repair following the Pearl Harbor assault. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack and now served aboard Akagi, radiated confidence as preparations intensified. The Japanese High Command estimated only 2 American carriers remained operational in the Pacific, Enterprise and Hornet, while their intelligence networks had failed to account for the hastily repaired Yorktown, a ghost ship that would soon haunt their ambitions. The strategic importance of Midway could not be overstated. This tiny atoll, barely 6 miles across, represented the westernmost defense of the Hawaiian Islands. Its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter, provide a staging point for future operations, and potentially draw out the American Pacific Fleet for the annihilation Yamamoto desperately sought. Yet the admiral harbored private reservations about the operation's complexity. The plan divided Japanese forces across multiple objectives, including a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, dispersing strength when concentration might prove crucial. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe commanded the submarine I-168, positioned along the cordon line intended to detect approaching American forces. However, the submarines arrived at their stations 2 days late, a timing failure that would prove catastrophic. Meanwhile, reconnaissance seaplanes that should have launched from French frigate shoals to survey Pearl Harbor found their refueling point occupied by American vessels, leaving Japanese commanders blind to enemy carrier movements. These operational failures, seemingly minor at the time, represented cracks in an elaborate facade of invincibility. Aboard Akagi, aircrews prepared their aircraft with meticulous care, loading armor-piercing bombs designed for ship targets. The carrier's deck bustled with activity as mechanics performed final inspections on Zero fighters and Val dive bombers. None suspected that American codebreak RS at Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had penetrated the Japanese naval code JN-25, transforming Yamamoto's surprise attack into an ambush. The hunters had become the hunted, though they sailed forward in blissful ignorance toward a rendezvous with catastrophe. June 4, 1942, transformed from anticipation to action as Vice Admiral Nagumo launched his initial strike against Midway at 4:30 in the morning. 108 aircraft, 36 Kate torpedo bombers carrying fragmentation bombs, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters roared from the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the formation through darkness toward the tiny atoll, his orders clear: destroy Midway's airfields and neutralize its ability to launch counterattacks. Behind them, on the carrier decks, a second wave stood ready, their aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for the American carriers that Japanese intelligence expected to sortie from Pearl Harbor. Commander Fuchida, recovering from appendicitis surgery, watched from Akagi's bridge as the strike force disappeared into pre-dawn gloom. The carriers maintained course northeast of Midway, positioned approximately 240 miles from the atoll. Nagumo's screening force included 2 Batty, Lee ships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, a formidable shield for the precious carriers. Yet the admiral faced an impossible dilemma that military historians would debate for decades. His aircraft were armed for either land attack or ship attack, and switching ordnance required precious time his situation would not afford. At 6:16 in the morning, Tomonaga's strike force reached Midway and encountered fierce anti-aircraft fire from the island's defenders. American Marine fighters, though hopelessly outmatched by the superior Zeros, threw themselves against the Japanese formation with desperate courage. Tomonaga's aircraft pounded the island's installations, setting fuel tanks ablaze and cratering runways, yet the lieutenant recognized immediately that a second strike would be necessary. American airfields remained operational, and the island's capacity to launch attacks persisted. He radioed back to Nagumo, "There is need for a second attack." This message triggered the crisis that would seal Japan's fate. Nagumo, still awaiting confirmation of American carrier positions, made the fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft with land attack bombs. Crews aboard the 4 carriers frantically began removing the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, wheeling the heavy ordnance across flight decks to elevators and down to magazines, then bringing up fragmentation bombs and landmines. The process created chaos below decks, with volatile explosives stacked carelessly in passageways. Safety protocols abandoned in the rush to comply with the admiral's orders. Then, at 7:28, Scout Plane Number 4 from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems, transmitted a message that electrified the Japanese command. "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships." Nagumo demanded clarification. Did the American force include carriers? The scout pilot's delayed response came at 8:09. "Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." The admiral's worst nightmare had materialized. American carriers were not fleeing toward Hawaii, but advancing to attack his fleet, and his aircraft were armed for the wrong target. Nagumo reversed his order. The reserve aircraft must be rearmed again, this time with anti-ship weapons. Below decks, exhausted ordnance crews began the laborious process anew, but time had become the enemy. Between 8:09 and 8:30, American torpedo bombers from Midway, antiquated devastators flying without fighter escort, began their attacks on the Japanese fleet. The slow, obsolete aircraft approached at wave-top level, struggling to reach attack positions as Zero fighters and anti-aircraft guns tore them apart. 15 devastators attacked, not one returned to Midway. Yet their sacrifice bought precious time, forcing the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently, further delaying the rearming operations below. Commander Amagai Takahisa, air officer aboard Akagi, watched the slaughter of American torpedo bombers with grim satisfaction, believing Japanese defenses impenetrable. But the desperate American attacks had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high altitudes undefended. Worse, the violent maneuvering scattered the Japanese carriers across miles of ocean, breaking their mutual defensive formation. On the hangar decks, aviation fuel spilled across steel floors, and bombs lay unchained beside aircraft being hastily prepared for launch. The stage was set for disaster. 10:24 on the morning of June 4, 1942, marked the moment Japanese naval aviation, the most feared force in the Pacific, began its descent into flames. Lieutenant Commander Claren, C. Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had gambled his remaining fuel on an extended search, and finally spotted the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi racing to rejoin Nagumo's fleet. Following that W-height arrow across blue water, McCluskey's 37 Dauntless dive bombers emerged from scattered clouds at 14,000 feet, directly above Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The carriers steamed in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed for launch, completely vulnerable to the attack diving toward them from the sun. Aboard Akagi, the first warning came not from lookouts but from the scream of diving aircraft. Lieutenant Takehiko Chihaya, assistant operations officer, looked up to see black shapes plummeting from the sky like vengeful demons. There was no time to man battle stations, no time to scramble additional fighters, no time to do anything but watch as the first bomb struck near Akagi's midship elevator. The explosion detonated armed aircraft on the flight deck, triggering secondary explosions from the ordnance scattered carelessly in the haste to rearm. Within minutes, aviation fuel spread rivers of fire across the hangar deck, and torpedoes began cooking off in the inferno. Commander Fuchida, knocked unconscious by the initial blast, awoke to find Akagi transformed into a hellscape. Flames consumed the flagship from within, spreading through passageways with terrifying speed. The firefighting systems, designed for smaller blazes, proved utterly inadequate against the cascading explosions rippling through the ship. Men trapped below deck screamed as temperatures soared beyond survivable levels. Admiral Nagumo, his headquarters staff, and the ship's captain, Taijiro Aoki, stood on the bridge watching their proud flagship die, helpless to intervene as the carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack became a funeral pyre for hundreds of her crew. Kaga suffered an even more catastrophic fate. Multiple bombs penetrated her flight deck, one detonating in the forward hangar and instantly killing everyone there. Another hit aft, igniting fueled aircraft and setting off a chain reaction among the carelessly stacked ordnance. Captain Jisaku Okada fought desperately to save his ship, but the fires spread faster than damage control parties could respond. The carrier's aviation fuel tanks ruptured, feeding the blaze with thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel. By 10:40, barely 16 minutes after the attack began, Kaga listed heavily to port, her flight deck a twisted ruin of burning metal, her crew abandoning ship into oil-slicked waters. Soryu, the smallest of the four carriers but beloved for her speed and efficiency, took 3 direct hits in rapid succession. Captain Ryusaku Yanagamoto refused to abandon ship even as flames engulfed the bridge, choosing to go down with his vessel in accordance with the ancient Bushido code. His crew, forced to leave him behind, wept as they climbed down ropes into the sea. Explosions continued to rock Soryu's hull as her magazines cooked off, each blast sending shrapnel and debris skyward. The carrier that had participated in every major Japanese operation since the war's beginning would sink at 7:13 that evening, carrying Captain Yanagamoto and hundreds of trapped crewmen to the bottom of the Pacific. In 5 minutes of devastation, 3/4 of Nagumo's carrier strike force had been transformed from instruments of conquest to burning wrecks. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu, steaming several miles north of the other carriers, had escaped the American dive bombers' attention. Yamaguchi, considered one of Japan's most aggressive and capable commanders, immediately launched a counterstrike. At 10:54, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters departed Hiryu's deck with orders to find and destroy the American carriers. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the formation, determined to avenge his stricken comrades and salvage something from the catastrophe unfolding around him. The psychological impact of watching 3 carriers burn simultaneously shattered Japanese confidence. Petty Officer Haruo Yoshino, a Zero pilot who had circled helplessly above the slaughter, later described the scene as resembling a volcano erupting from the sea. The smoke columns rose thousands of feet, visible for miles, black pillars marking the funeral of Japanese naval supremacy. Officers and enlisted men alike struggled to process what their eyes witnessed. The supposedly invincible combined fleet, which had ranged freely across the Pacific for 6 months, crippled in moments by an enemy they had dismissed as demoralized and beaten. Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, became Admiral Yamaguchi's instrument of vengeance as the morning of June 4, 1942 descended into afternoon carnage. Lieutenant Kobayashi's strike force located the American carrier Yorktown at approximately 12:10, despite the Americans' desperate attempts to hide beneath cloud cover. The Japanese pilots pushed through intense anti-aircraft fire and fighter screens, demonstrating the exceptional training and courage that had made them the most feared aviators in the Pacific. 3 bombs struck Yorktown, penetrating her flight deck and starting fires that seemed to doom the American carrier. Japanese pilots returned to Hiryu reporting the target destroyed, their first positive news in a day of disasters. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, a graduate of Princeton University who understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues, knew that sinking one carrier would not salvage Japanese fortunes. He ordered an immediate second strike, despite having only 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 fighters available. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had survived the morning strike on Midway, only to have his aircraft damaged by anti-aircraft fire, volunteered. Red to lead the attack despite knowing his fuel tank had been holed. It would be a one-way mission, a death flight that epitomized the warrior spirit consuming Japanese naval aviation. At 2:30, Tomonaga's formation launched from Hiryu's deck, every man aboard understanding they faced overwhelming odds. Tomonaga's torpedo bombers pressed their attack with suicidal determination, several aircraft flying directly into anti-aircraft fire rather than break off their runs. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown, dooming the American carrier to a slow death, despite heroic damage control efforts. Tomonaga himself, his fuel exhausted, deliberately crashed his blazing Kate into the sea near the Amerites. Task Force, his final act one of defiance against the enemy that had shattered Japanese naval dominance. The strike force achieved its objective, but the price proved devastating. Only 5 aircraft returned to Hiryu, and Japanese pilots reported attacking the same carrier hit that morning, unaware that a second American carrier, Enterprise, remained operational and hunting for them. The Americans responded with cold efficiency that demonstrated why industrial democracies made such formidable enemies. Enterprise launched a strike of 24 Dauntless dive bombers at 3:30, guided by radio direction finding fixes on Hiryu's transmissions. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, who had already helped destroy Akagi that morning, led a section of bomb airs through defensive fire that tore his aircraft but failed to stop his attack. At 5:03, 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession, transforming Japan's last operational carrier into the same kind of blazing wreck that had consumed her sisters. The hits ignited fueled aircraft on the flight deck and penetrated to the hangar, where more armed and fueled planes awaited launch. Captain Tomeo Kaku and Admiral Yamaguchi faced the same impossible situation that had doomed their colleagues. Fires spreading faster than damage control could contain them, magazines beginning to cook off, and hundreds of men trapped in compartments filling with smoke and heat. Damage control parties worked with desperate courage, but the intensity of the fires overwhelmed all attempts at containment. By 6:30, Kaku ordered all hands to abandon ship, though he and Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard, their fates sealed by tradition and honor. The 2 officers were last seen on the bridge, contemplating the burning wreckage of their fleet and the implications for Japan's future. Yamamoto, monitoring events from his distant position aboard Yamato, finally grasped the magnitude of the disaster. The carefully planned operation to annihilate American carrier forces had instead resulted in the loss of 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with their irreplaceable air groups. The admiral faced an agonizing decision: press forward with high-S battleships and cruisers in hopes of forcing a night surface action or acknowledge defeat and withdraw. His subordinates urged attack, their warrior ethos demanding they seek death rather than retreat. But Yamamoto possessed the strategic vision to recognize that losing the combined fleet's battleship corps would accomplish nothing except complete the disaster already unfolding. At 2:55 in the morning of June 5, 1942, Yamamoto issued the order that marked the beginning of Japan's long defeat. Occupation of Midway is canceled. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, turned westward in retreat. Behind them, 4 carriers burned, or had already slipped beneath the waves, carrying with them the flower of Japanese naval aviation, the pilots, mechanics, and deck crews who had made the fleet's victories possible. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen died in the waters near Midway, their loss a wound from which Japan's naval aviation would never recover. The night of June 4th into June 5th, 1942, brought no respite for the retreating Japanese forces, only the cold calculus of disaster. Admiral Yamamoto sat in Yamato's operations room, reviewing reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. 4 fleet carriers destroyed. More than 248 aircraft lost. Not just the machines, which could eventually be replaced, but the pilots who flew them, veterans whose training and sea combat experience represented years of investment. Captain Kuroshima Kameto, the combined fleet senior staff officer, advocated launching a night surface action, arguing that Japanese superiority in night fighting tactics might salvage victory from catastrophe. Yamamoto refused, recognizing that risking his battleships would not recover the 4 carriers already lost, and might deliver Japan's surface fleet to destruction as well. The human cost of the battle continued mounting even as the fleet withdrew. Destroyers circled through debris fields, picking up survivors from the four carriers, hauling exhausted, burned, and oil-soaked men from the Pacific's cold embrace. Akagi remained afloat, but burning uncontrollably throughout the night, her hull glowing orange from internal fires that consumed everything combustible within her frame. At dawn on June 5th, destroyers Arashi, Nowaki, Ajikaze, and Maikaze surrounded the dying flagship. Captain Aoki, who had been forced to transfer his flag hours earlier, gave the final order. Torpedoes from the destroyers struck Akagi's hull, the mercy blow that sent the flagship beneath the waves at 5:20 in the morning, carrying her remaining dead to a grave nearly 18,000 feet deep. Kaga had already sunk during the previous evening, taking Captain Okada and 800 of her crew to the bottom. Soryu followed at 7:13 on June 4th, her captain still standing on the bridge as the sea claimed his ship. Hiryu, toughest of the four carriers, refused to die quickly. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku remained aboard throughout the night, directing firefighting efforts that proved futile against the spreading flames. At 5:10 on the morning of June 5th, with the carrier still afloat but clearly doomed, Yamaguchi dismissed his staff, handed his cap to a subordinate as a final message to his family, and chose to die with his ship. Hiryu finally rolled over and sank at 9:12, taking with her one of Japan's finest naval mines. The surviving heavy cruisers Mikuma and Mogami, ordered to bombard Midway during the night as part of Yamamoto's canceled offensive, collided while making an emergency turn to retreat. Mogami's bow crumpled against Mikuma's port side, flooding several compartments and leaving both ships trailing oil and limping westward at reduced speed. At 6:05 on the morning of June 5th, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found the wound, dead cruisers, and attacked mercilessly. Mikuma absorbed multiple bomb hits that transformed her into a burning hulk, her crew abandoning ship as fires consumed the vessel. She sank the following morning, adding 700 more names to the battle's casualty list. Mogami survived but required months of repairs, emerging from the shipyard as a hybrid cruiser carrier, her reconstruction necessitated by damage inflicted during a retreat that symbolized Japan's new reality. Submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Tanabe, represented the sole Japanese success in the battle's aftermath. On June 6th, his vessel encountered the crippled Yorktown under tow toward Pearl Harbor. Despite determined efforts by American destroyers to protect their wounded carrier, Tanabe maneuvered into attack position and fired 4 torpedoes at 15:31. 2 struck Yorktown while 1 hit the destroyer Hammond, which sank in 4 minutes. Yorktown lingered until the following morning before finally rolling over and sinking, denying the Americans the satisfaction of saving their wounded carrier. Yet this minor tactical victory could not obscure the strategic catastrophe Japan had suffered. The retreat continued through June 6th and 7th, 1942, with American submarines stalking the Japanese fleet's withdrawal. The submarines achieved little beyond harassment, but their presence added to the psychological pressure bearing down on Japanese commanders. Officers and de-enlisted men alike struggled to process what had occurred. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered battle at Midway as the dominant force in the Pacific, masters of carrier warfare, who had terrorized Allied positions from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. They retreated as a diminished fleet that had lost not only 4 carriers, but something more precious, the aura of invincibility that had cloaked Japanese arms since the war's beginning. Yamamoto maintained his command presence throughout the withdrawal, but those close to him noticed the change. The admiral who had opposed war with America from the beginning, who had warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but could guarantee nothing thereafter, now watched his prediction materialize with tragic precision. The Battle of Midway had occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, marking the end of Japanese expansion and the beginning of a grinding defensive war against an enemy whose industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's. The admiral understood, even if many of his subordinates did not, that the 4 carriers lying at the bottom of the Pacific represented more than sunken ships. They marked the beginning of Japan's defeat. The combined fleet limped back to Japanese waters in mid-June, 1942, carrying with it survivors whose accounts of the disaster spread through the naval establishment, despite official attempts at secrecy. Captain Fuchida, evacuated from Akagi with broken ankles, sustained hundreds of other wounded from the 4 carriers. The corridors filled with burned men wrapped in bandages, their suffering a stark contrast to the triumphant atmosphere that had pervaded Japanese naval bases since Pearl Harbor. Fuchida later wrote that the wounded men spoke little of their experiences, traumatized by the speed with which their seemingly invincible carriers had been transformed into funeral pyres. The Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to conceal the magnitude of the defeat from both the public and the Army. Surviving officers and enlisted men from the 4 carriers found themselves transferred to isolated assignments where they could not spread news of the disaster. Families of the dead received notification that their loved ones had died in action, but were given no details about the battle or the ship's fates. The government announced a great victory at Midway, claiming significant American losses while minimizing Japanese casualties. This deception would persist for months, preventing honest assessment of what had gone wrong and hampering efforts to learn from the battle's lessons. Vice Admiral Nagumo survived the battle physically unscathed but professionally devastated. The admiral who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor now bore responsibility for losing 4 carriers in a single day. His decision to rearm the reserve aircraft twice, first for a second land attack on Midway, then for anti-ship operations when American carriers appeared, had left his fleet vulnerable at the crucial moment. Historians would debate whether different choices might have yielded different results, but the question remained whether any commander could have overcome the fundamental disadvantage Nagumo faced. The Americans had broken Japanese codes and knew where and when the attack would occur. The hunter had walked into an ambush, his target forewarned and prepared. The material losses, while severe, represented only part of the disaster. Japan's shipyards could theoretically construct replacement carriers, though not quickly. The Hio and Junyo, converted passenger liners already under construction, would join the fleet by mid-year. The fleet carrier Taiho, designed to incorporate lessons from early war experience, was under construction, but would not commission until 1944. However, replacing the pilots, mechanics, flight deck crews, and aviation specialists lost at Midway proved impossible. Pre-war training programs had produced superbly skilled aviators through rigorous selection and lengthy instruction, but Japan lacked the resources to duplicate these programs at scale during wartime. The men who died at Midway represented irreplaceable assets whose loss would handicap Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the conflict. Admiral Yamamoto faced his own reckoning with the battle's implications. The architect of Pearl Harbor had designed the Midway operation as a decisive battle that would force America to negotiate peace on Japanese terms. Instead, he had delivered Japan's carriers into a trap and lost the very assets needed to maintain control of the Pacific. The admiral submitted his resignation to Navy Minister Shimada Shigetaro, accepting full responsibility for the disaster. The ministry refused the resignation, recognizing that removing Yamamoto would accomplish nothing except deprive Japan of its most capable naval strategist. Yet the admiral never truly recovered from Midway, continuing to command but carrying the weight of the defeat until his death in April 1943, when American fighters intercepted and shot down his aircraft over Bougainville. The strategic situation facing Japan after Midway deteriorated rapidly. American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, forcing Japan into a grinding attritional campaign that consumed remaining naval aviation assets at an unsustainable rate. The converted carriers Hio and Junyo, pressed into service to compensate for the Midway losses, proved inferior to the fleet. At carriers they replaced, with smaller air groups and less robust construction. Meanwhile, American shipyards began producing Essex-class fleet carriers at a pace Japan could not match. The Enterprise, which had survived Midway, would be joined by dozens of sister ships, each representing a nail in Imperial Japan's coffin. Japanese naval aviators, those who survived Midway and subsequent battles, watched their service's gradual collapse with bitter understanding. Petty Officer Yoshino, whose Zero had circled uselessly above the burning carriers at Midway, survived until October 1944, when he died during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Before his death, he wrote to his family describing the deteriorating quality of replacement pilots. The young men joining us now have barely a quarter of our training. They fly bravely but lack the skills to survive modern combat. We veterans die one by one, and none replace us. His letter captured the essence of Japan's naval aviation tragedy. Midway had broken the back of a force that could not be rebuilt. The institutional response to Midway within the Imperial Japanese Navy revealed flaws more dangerous than the tactical defeat itself. Captain Ohmai Toshikazu, a staff officer at Naval General Headquarters, later described the atmosphere following the battle as one of deliberate ignorance. Senior officers refused to conduct thorough analysis of what had gone wrong, preferring to attribute the defeat to bad luck rather than systemic failures in planning, intelligence, and doctrine. This refusal to learn from catastrophe would handicap Japanese operations throughout the remainder of the war, transforming Midway from a recoverable setback into the beginning of an irreversible decline. Commander Genda Minoru, the air operations officer who had helped plan both Pearl Harbor and Midway, spent weeks after the battle attempting to compile lessons-learned documents for distribution to the fleet. His superiors suppressed these reports, fearing they would damage morale and undermine confidence in the combined fleet's leadership. Genda identified critical VU, on-air abilities, the inadequacy of carrier damage control procedures, the dangerous practice of storing armed ordnance in hangar bays during rearming operations, and the failure to maintain adequate combat air patrols at high altitude. These observations, which might have saved Japanese carriers in subsequent battles, never reached the officers who needed them most. The culture of silence served institutional pride while condemning future operations to repeat Midway's mistakes. The intelligence failure that enabled the American ambush went largely unexamined. Japanese naval intelligence officers had assured their superiors that American code-breaking efforts posed no threat to operational security. The reality, that Station Hypo in Hawaii had penetrated the JN-25 naval code and provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with precise information about Japanese plans, remained unknown to most Japanese commanders until after the war ended. Even when suspicions arose that codes might have been compromised, institutional inertia and overconfidence prevented thorough security reviews. Japan continued using variations of JN-25 throughout the war, providing American codebreakers with ongoing access to Japanese operational plans. The treatment of survivors reflected broader failures in how the Imperial Japanese Navy processed defeat. Officers and enlisted men from the four carriers faced unofficial stigma for having survived while their ships sank. The Bushido-influenced military culture viewed survival from a defeated ship with suspicion, as though living constituted a form of cowardice. Captain Aoki, who had commanded Akagi and survived her loss, found himself assigned to administrative positions, far from combat commands. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, whose injuries prevented his death aboard Akagi, faced subtle but persistent questions about why he had lived while so many died. This toxic attitude discouraged honest discussion of the battle's lessons and promoted a culture where death was preferable to survival with knowledge. The strategic lessons from Midway proved even more elusive to Japanese planners. The battle demonstrated that carrier warfare had become a contest of intelligence, detection, and rapid strike coordination, not merely pilot skill and ship numbers. American radar technology, while primitive by later standards, had provided Yorktown and Enterprise with early warning of incoming attacks. Japanese carriers lacked comparable systems, relying on visual spotting that proved inadequate against high-altitude attacks. Rather than prioritizing radar development and installation on surviving carriers, Japanese naval authorities continued emphasizing pilot training and offensive doctrine, doubling down on methods that Midway had proven insufficient. The economic implications of Midway received similarly inadequate attention. Japan had entered the war with a carrier force built over 2 decades of naval expansion. Replacing 4 fleet carriers required resources, and could not spare while simultaneously maintaining army operations in China, defending newly conquered territories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and sustaining civilian populations at home. American shipyards operated with virtually unlimited access to steel, trained workers, and industrial capacity. Japanese yards struggled with material shortages, labor constraints, and bombing threats. The mathematics of attrition favored America overwhelmingly. Yet Japanese planners continued operating as though willpower and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage. By December 1942, 6 months after Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy had not recovered from the battle's losses. The carrier force consisted of converted light carriers and the survivors of earlier campaigns, ships worn down by continuous operations without adequate maintenance. American forces, meanwhile, had begun their inexorable advance across the EU Pacific, each step forward supported by growing numbers of new carriers, aircraft, and trained crews. The disparity that Admiral Yamamoto had feared before the war commenced now manifested with brutal clarity, and the failure to honestly assess Midway's lessons meant Japan repeated its mistakes until defeat became inevitable and absolute. The full scope of what transpired during those fateful hours of June 4, 1942, did not become clear to the Japanese public until after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. Only then did surviving officers feel free to speak openly about the disaster at Midway, their accounts painting a picture of institutional failure that extended far beyond tactical mistakes. Commander Fuchida, who had witnessed Akagi's destruction from her deck, eventually published his experiences in collaboration with American authors, his testimony revealing the human cost of strategic overreach and cultural blindness that had doomed Japan's naval ambitions before they truly began. The 4 carriers resting 18,000 feet beneath the Pacific's surface became symbols of Japan's trajectory through World War II, from the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor that seemed to demonstrate invincibility, through the hubris of Midway where that illusion shattered, to final defeat against an enemy whose industrial capacity made Japanese victory impossible from the war's outset. Admiral Yamamoto's warning to his superiors before Pearl Harbor, that he could run wild for 6 months but guarantee nothing thereafter, proved prophetic with eerie precision. Midway occurred almost exactly 6 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, marking the moment when Japan's initial conquests gave way to defensive warfare and inevitable retreat. The pilots who died during the battle represented perhaps the most tragic aspect of Japan's Midway defeat. Men like Lieutenant Tomonaga, who deliberately flew a crippled aircraft on a one-way mission against Yorktown, embodied courage and skill that deserved better leadership and strategic vision. Petty Officer First Class Takeshi Maeda, a dive bomber pilot killed during the morning attack on Midway, left behind a young wife and infant son he would never see. Aviation machinist Kazuo Kano died in Hiryu's engine room, scalded by steam when bombs ruptured the carrier's boilers. These men and thousands like them paid with their lives for decisions made by commanders who refused to acknowledge America's code-breaking advantage, who divided their forces across too many objectives, and who prioritized offensive glory over operational security. The submarine crews who failed to detect American carrier movements faced their own bitter aftermath. Lieutenant Commander Tanabe of I-168 achieved the operation's only success by sinking the crippled Yorktown, but his personal victory could not obscure the screening force's systemic failure. Submarines arrived late at their stations, allowed American carriers to pass undetected, and contributed nothing to the battle's critical phases. Post-war annally, CIS revealed that the elaborate submarine cordon had been compromised before it began. American codebreakers knew the patrol line's positions and simply routed carriers around them. The submariners' failure, like so many aspects of Midway, stemmed from the fundamental intelligence disadvantage under which Japanese forces operated. Modern historians, both Japanese and American, have spent decades analyzing Midway's implications for naval warfare and national strategy. The battle demonstrated that technological advantage and intelligence superiority could offset numerical disadvantage and even superior pilot training. It showed that complex operations requiring precise timing and coordination on across dispersed forces invited disaster when opponents possessed foreknowledge of intentions. Most fundamentally, Midway revealed that wars between industrial powers ultimately became contests of production capacity, and in such contests, Japan could never prevail against American manufacturing might. The wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu remained undiscovered until the late 20th and early 21st centuries, when deep-sea exploration technology finally located them in their deep ocean graves. Photographs of the wrecks show remarkably preserved structures, recognizable despite decades of deterioration. Flight decks still bearing the scars of bomb impacts, hangar bays where aircraft once prepared for missions, and compartments where men lived and died during those catastrophic hours. These images provide silent testimony to a battle that changed the Pacific War's trajectory and demonstrated the limits of courage and skill when divorced from strategic wisdom. For the veterans who survived Midway and lived to see Japan's post-war reconstruction, the battle carried complex meanings. Some, like Fuchida, eventually reconciled with the war's tragedy extended beyond national boundaries to encompass all who fought and suffered. Others carried bitterness to their graves, unable to forgive the leadership failures that had squandered so many lives in pursuit of an unwinnable conflict. Captain Aoki, who had commanded Akagi and who watched helplessly as his flagship burned, spent his remaining years in quiet reflection, rarely speaking of the battle that had defined and ended his operational career. He died in 1973, taking with him memories of that terrible morning when Japan's naval supremacy died in fire and smoke. The Japanese naval officers who planned the Midway operation faced varying fates in the war's remaining years. Admiral Nagumo, despite the disaster, retained command positions until October 1944, when he committed suicide on Saipan as American forces overran the island. His death by his own hand reflected the Bushido tradition that demanded commanders accept responsibility for defeat through self-sacrifice, a cultural practice that prevented institutional learning by removing experienced officers who might have shared hard-won wisdom with their successors. Captain Kuroshima survived the war and spent his final years teaching naval history, his lectures carefully avoiding detailed discussion of Midway's lessons, the culture of silence persisting even in peacetime. The enlisted men who survived the four carriers' destruction returned to a navy increasingly desperate for experienced personnel. Many found themselves training the hastily prepared replacement pilots whose inadequate skills Petty Officer Yoshino had lamented before his death. These veterans watched with anguish as young pilots, given barely months of training compared to the years the pre-war aviators had received, flew to their deaths in unequal battles against increasingly dominant American forces. By 1944, the quality gap between Japanese and American naval aviators had become so vast that even numerical parity could not produce favorable outcomes. The survivors of Midway understood that the irreplaceable expertise lost when the four carriers sank could never be reconstituted, regardless of how many replacement aircraft rolled from factories. The families of men who died at Midway received official notification couched in euphemistic language about heroic sacrifices and glorious deaths in service to the Emperor. Only after the war ended did many widows and parents learn the true circumstances of their loved ones' deaths, trapped in burning ships, drowned when carriers sank before they could escape, or killed in the futile attacks that preceded the American dive bombers' devastating strikes. Mrs. Tominaga, widow of the lieutenant who had led both the morning attack on Midway and the afternoon strike against Yorktown, learned only in 1946 that her husband had deliberately flown a damaged aircraft on what he knew would be a suicide mission. The knowledge brought no comfort, only belated understanding of the desperation that had consumed Japanese commanders as their carefully planned operation disintegrated. The strategic consequences of Midway extended far beyond the immediate loss of four carriers. The battle forced Japan onto the defensive permanently, transforming the Pacific War from a contest of Japanese expansion versus American containment into a grinding advance by American forces toward the Japanese home islands. Each subsequent battle, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, saw Japanese forces fighting with diminishing resources against an enemy whose strength grew exponentially. The carrier pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, those few who survived Midway and subsequent engagements, found themselves flying obsolete aircraft against numerically superior opponents equipped with better technology. The Zero fighter, which had dominated Pacific skies in 1941 and early 1942, became a death trap by 1944, when facing American Hellcats and Corsairs flown by well-trained pilots. Modern Japan's relationship with the Battle of Midway remains complex and often uncomfortable. The engagement represents a clear turning point where hubris and institutional dysfunction produced catastrophic defeat. Yet discussing these failures requires confronting difficult questions about the military culture that produced them. Japanese historians have published detailed analyses of the battle, many incorporating American sources and perspectives to provide comprehensive understanding of what occurred. These works, far more heinous than anything possible during the war years, acknowledge the intelligence failures, tactical mistakes, and strategic overreach that doomed the Midway operation from its inception. Yet popular understanding remains limited, with many Japanese citizens possessing only vague awareness of a battle that profoundly shaped their nation's history. The physical evidence of Midway continues emerging from the deep Pacific. In October 2019, research vessel Petrel located the wreck of Kaga, her massive hull resting upright on the ocean floor, her flight deck partially collapsed but still recognizable. Photographs showed the carrier's island superstructure, twisted gun mounts, and the scattered debris field SE. Surrounding the main wreckage, artifacts of a lost morning when Japanese naval aviation reached its zenith and immediately began its decline. The discovery prompted renewed interest in Japan about the battle, with documentaries and publications examining Midway's lessons for contemporary audiences. These modern analyses emphasize the dangers of institutional arrogance, the critical importance of intelligent security, and the necessity of honest self-assessment after setbacks. For military professionals worldwide, the Battle of Midway from the Japanese perspective offers enduring lessons that transcend specific historical circumstances. The operation demonstrated how complex plans requiring perfect timing and coordination become vulnerable when opponents possess intelligence advantages. It showed that operational security failures can transform carefully prepared offensives into disasters. Most critically, Midway illustrated how institutional culture, the Japanese Navy's refusal to acknowledge possible code compromise, its reluctance to conduct honest after-action analysis, and its emphasis on offensive spirit over technological reality, can compound tactical defeats into strategic catastrophes. Modern military organizations study Midway not to refight old battles, but to avoid repeating the patterns of denial and dysfunction that transformed a naval engagement into the beginning of national defeat. The sun that rose on June 4, 1942 over the Central Pacific illuminated what appeared to be Japan's inevitable victory. 4 powerful carriers steaming toward an objective, supported by battleships and cruisers, crewed by veterans of half a year of uninterrupted conquest. That same sun set on burning wrecks and thousands of dead, marking the end of Japan's 6-month rampage across the Pacific and the beginning of a long retreat that would culminate in atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki 3 years later. The men who fought and died at Midway, both Japanese and American, could not have known they were participating in one of history's decisive battles. They simply did their duty as they understood it, fighting with courage and skill that their strategic situation could not ultimately redeem. Their sacrifice, particularly on the Japanese side where systemic failures at the highest levels squandered lives and materiel, demands remembrance not as glorification of war but as somber acknowledgement of how leadership failures extract terrible costs from those who must execute flawed plans with their lives.